Hi, everybody. This is Christopher Phillips, founder of Democracy Cafe, dedicated to making ours a more livable, lovable, and connected world on all kinds of scales. And our guest today is Eric Liu. Eric's a civic mover and shaker in so many different areas. But Eric, I think of your work as sort of a symphonic theme and variation. I have carried like a pocket Bible your book, Gardens of Democracy, all those years ago. And I feel like everything since then has kind of been a spoke in some ways to all that.
Yeah, I like that. I like the symphonic metaphor because I'm a music person. But another one, which may be even more apt given the title of the book you carry around, is it's just seeds and sprouts.
Seeds and sprouts.
Everywhere.
Yes, it's so your latest two books, you're incredibly prolific, and you somehow have extraordinarily thriving and expanding nonprofit organizations that you've co-founded. Citizen University, which people can see at citizenuniversity.us, is Become America's Civic Sermons on Love, Responsibility, and Democracy. And just preceding that, You're More Powerful Than You Think, A Citizen's Guide to Making Change Happen. Eric, so your book on civic sermons, Become America, you had 19 sermons in that, and you've done a good many since then.
Yeah. That book, which came out in 2019, collected the first 19 or so sermons that I delivered at this gathering that our team at Citizen University pioneered several years ago, called Civic Saturdays. And these gatherings are essentially a civic analog to a faith gathering. It's not a faith gathering in a traditional, church or synagogue sense, but it has the arc and the flow and the feel of one, where you sing together, you turn to strangers next to you, there are readings of text, there's a sermon, but it's all focused on what we think of as American civic religion, on the creed and the ideas and ideals that we at least profess to believe in and try to live up to in American life, and what it actually is going to take for us to close the gap between those that creed and our actual deeds. And so, yeah, Civic Saturdays have since become a phenomenon around the country. But whenever we hold one in Seattle, I typically write and deliver a sermon. And so this book collected the first 19 of those.
Yes. What was it like to do it more extemporaneously? How was the process different? Was it better, worse, discomforting, or exhilarating to do it? Yeah.
Part of what you're referring to is we, in this age of coronavirus, have begun to do our Civic Saturdays, which have always been by design in person, face to face, where you can feel and touch and sense the energy of people around you. We, of course, have had to pivot to online. And so we've now done a couple of these virtual Civic Saturdays. And the first one I did like the usual one, where I'd written out a 10-page sermon and read it. And it was okay. I mean, it was a good sermon, I thought, but there was a sense of distance with the kind of participants and viewers. So our most recent one, I just had some notes and I did speak more extemporaneously. And I mean, you should be the judge. You're there, you watch it. But from my perspective as the person speaking, it felt much better. I felt much more live and connected in real time with people and not reading at people.
Well, so do you think you'll continue that even when we can do them face to face again? To the more extemporaneous style?
It may be. I mean, most of the public speaking actually that I do is extemporaneous off of notes. The sermons that I started giving for Civic Saturday became the rare exception, the rare but increasingly frequent exception, in which I did a few days earlier write out and craft a text and then just deliver that text. And so my natural mode is much more natural.
Well, it was interesting. I felt that I was very much leaning in, and I felt a lot of very different kind of emotions, to the point that I forgot that we were doing this virtually, to be honest with you.
Wow.
I was very moved by your, confession about how you referred to you're walking with your 83-year-old mother, and then you sort of said millennial to somebody who clearly just didn't care about that you were walking with your mother. And
we didn't observe any social distancing and just was running and sweating, and she ran right past was kind of run until I had to kind of gesture her to get 6 feet away, and she said, "Seriously?" And as she passed, I said, "Yeah, seriously." And then more than muttered under my breath, said loud enough for her to hear, "Millennial," which, as I confessed in the sermon, I was not proud of. I don't. She, in that instance, was clearly not in the right social normatively, but that was rather small of me. And the point of that confession was just the larger point in that sermon, which is all of us have all of this in us all the time, both the kind of virtue and the civic virtue and the kind of selfishness, the protecting your own in a way that'll make you behave, if not sociopathically, less civilly. And so that's there all the time.
So you use several times the term sociopath.
Yeah.
In your talk. I mean, I was brought up Greek Orthodox, my dad's side, Methodist on my mother's side after she broke away from the Jehovah's Witness faith that she was brought up in. She was born and raised in an Appalachian coal mining camp. So I've been brought up on John 8:7, let he who is without sin cast the first stone. So I'm reticent to use words like sociopath because I think it's too easy to cubbyhole and make cardboard cutouts of people. So I was a little, I don't know, I think I was a little uneasy with that term because when you said, for instance, that you can't measure, the distance can't be measured between an FDR, and you gave some stirring citations from his, I believe his first inaugural speech to Donald Trump. Well, I mean, it had me thinking about FDR, and he, gave the order to intern 120,000 Japanese, 62% of whom were Americans, American citizens. He snubbed Jesse Owens at, there's this myth that Hitler snubbed him. Hitler wasn't even at the games at that. He snubbed everybody. Yeah. But and then he wouldn't approve the Republican initiated legislation for make it a federal crime of lynchings. And he also had Hugo Black on the Supreme Court. It was a KKK member. So I worry when
I think I'm glad you felt discomfited because part of the point in that framing and phrasing of that dyad of citizen and sociopath is precisely to discomfit. I think I have enough of an awareness of shades of gray, and just in my work generally, and even in the rest of that sermon, to acknowledge that things are not that binary all the time. But I think that particularly in a time of crisis, it is important, let me put it this way. I think it's more important to be able to name right and wrong and to be able to name with confidence morally constructive behavior versus morally destructive behavior than it is to split hairs. I mean, we can split hairs all day long, but FDR, I don't think FDR is what walks on water. But as a public figure, I continue to insist there's not a map large enough to measure the distance between him and Donald Trump. Not that FDR didn't sin in the ways that you described, but in his capacity to lead a nation through crisis and so forth. So, I am not as an Asian American, I'm highly attuned to what he did in Japanese American internment and the precedent he set, and that there's nothing that Trump has done, something like the Muslim ban, that FDR hadn't, in a sense, done first. And yet, there was no time during the FDR's public leadership was not premised on division, mistruth, and utter abdication of responsibility, and in the Trumpian way of literally saying, "I take no responsibility at all." The buck stops here is Truman, not FDR, but that statement, "I take no responsibility at all," it is the polar opposite of the buck stops here. And in a time of polls, it's important to be able to name the polls, even if we don't live at them all the time.
I guess I was thinking the whole time of the person who's influenced everything I do, which is Eleanor Roosevelt.
Yeah.
I mean, her Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is now, etched with the United Nations, that has driven virtually everything I do. And I
Yeah.
feel like nobody can measure the distance to her. If
Yeah.
anybody is saintly and human, it was her.
Yeah. Well, look, I think part of the challenge and part of what the intention of the provocation there, and this goes back to, a smaller book that I'd written years ago that called The True Patriot, in which my co-author Nick Hanauer and I were, arguing that the left had surrendered patriotism, the right had co-opted it, and to the detriment of both. I think there are often people who are left of center or quite left, who feel an aversion to making moral judgments, who are moral relativists, who don't want to, who are a bit overly empathetic and don't want to name right and wrong. And this is not a time for that. The people who are gathering in these AstroTurf rallies at state capitals to liberate Michigan or liberate Virginia are behaving in a sociopathic way. Rand Paul, knowing that he had coronavirus and then choosing to go to work and go
he was a doctor. He broke the Hippocratic Oath.
Physician who literally knows better. That was sociopathic behavior. Which is to say, it was all about him and his principles and his ideas, and without regard to the impact that it might have on other people. And that kind of other blindness. When you hear some of these protesters say, "Well, I'm ready to meet my maker. I just don't want these restrictions." Well, great. If you're ready to meet your maker, go meet your maker. You brought your guns, go meet your maker. That doesn't mean that people around you are ready to meet their maker. The people who you would infect are not ready to meet their maker. So to me, that is the very crystallized definition of sociopathy.
Well, Nick Hanauer, I'm glad you mentioned him, who co-authored with you those first books. He gave a powerful TED talk about the fact that this new gilded age where there's no such thing as enough when it comes to material possessions, that it has bred sociopathy. I mean, he called it. And I haven't seen a whole lot of people do that. He wasn't just pointing this particular person or that. I mean, he was saying this whole type of era where there's no such thing as enough financially, materially. And he's somebody who's doing really well. But I thought, I was very moved by that and the insight of that, because that's exactly what happened in Athens. Suddenly there was this grasping, this naked grasping that there's hell to pay for that.
Yeah, and we have to be able to look. Our work at Citizen University orients around two dimensions of citizenship. One is power, and an understanding of how power works, and being literate in it and fluent in how you can exercise power. But the other is character. And power without character is kind of weaponized sociopathy. But character without power is mere philosophizing, right? And simply having a moral code and a strong sense of ethics and virtue without having any earthly idea how to get stuff done does not add up to full citizenship. And so, the citizen, by which I don't mean documentation status, but in this kind of broader ethical sense of being a member of the body and a contributor to community, has to cultivate both a knowledge of power and these capacities for character in the collective, how we live together, behave together, and hold norms together that allow our union to be sustained.
Yes, I think I think of those terms a lot because I wonder, and the strain of Socratic inquiry that I do is the strain that's not Socrates the skeptic. It's Socrates that says, and he served in political office, and he wouldn't do things that the oligarchs like Trump would want him to do. He wasn't about to demonize people and scapegoat. He put his life on the line for that. So to me, it's about developing the forms of critical self-awareness, where an open society willingly casts a lens on itself to say, where am I not bringing the promise of our society into alignment? And what are the contradictions between what we say and what we do?
Yeah, which I think is, it's certainly that's the spirit of our work, but it's also been the spirit of your work. And all of the, whether it's conversations, Socrates, democracy cafes that you've been catalyzing around the country and around the world, are meant to cultivate that capacity for discernment. To me, moral discernment which isn't only about seeing shades of gray, but it's recognizing that there are times for shades of gray and there are times for the kind of polar binaries. And to be able to know the difference is part of what it means to have moral discernment.
Mhm. You know, my father's family came dirt poor from Greece in 1922, just before Congress passed a draconian law that prohibited further Southern Italians and Greeks, meaning poor, from coming. He developed it, even though he became very successful in his way, he had a severe lisp his whole life for being teased mercilessly for having a thick Greek accent. He never got over that. And so the things that really get my emotions boiling are the intentional xenophobic comments like the Chinese virus, the China virus. I feel that.
Yeah.
I truly feel it. And so I ask myself, what can I do to tamp down just going after this one person that's feeding deliberately into other people's racism across the political spectrum, frankly?
Yeah.
What can I do as an individual? And then I come back to what you said, civic character is character in the collective, how we live together, how we behave in public. And so I'm wrestling with how I can get off Twitter and doing the insult thing. And in this day of coronavirus, when I'm here in my little office, you can see I can't get a haircut or anything.
Me neither.
But what do I ask myself, what can I do to combat that xenophobia in a healthful way, recognizing my own faults?
Well, you're doing it. I mean, to me, your decision to keep on hosting these conversations, and I know you've, been talking with other people like Jim and Deb Fallows, and this moment to create a space where people can actually model what it's like to reckon with our times and to make moral discernments and to place our current crisis in the context of history, both when that can be inspiring, like the side of FDR who stirred us to unity and action in the course of the Depression, but also warns us that the side of FDR, as you said, who interned Japanese Americans, that both of those were present, and both of those, Lincoln, who I worship in many ways, suspended habeas corpus, was moved to emancipate slaves, but just certainly did not, in the course of his earlier career, avow that he certainly did not want one for his wife. So he was not exactly a 21st century enlightened progressive. And so our ability to kind of understand our times in the context of history is what you're doing by holding these conversations. And I think it's a service right now, what you're doing.
In your civic collaboratory gathering the day before Civic Saturday, and you asked, well, what are we fearful of? I was almost fearful to say. I mean, I support all my work through my own presentations and workshops. I lost everything. I've lost $70,000 in work. Poof, it's gone. So I'm scared in a way I've never been before in my life. And I put my hand up and then I put it down because I was afraid I was going to cry.
Well, thank you for telling me that now in this setting. And I feel you. That is scary and
really scary.
And I really sincerely hope that in our next gathering, you will raise your hand and say that, and you won't be afraid to cry if that's what
Well, I still am actually right now.
Yeah, because
it's hard to talk about.
It's hard to talk about, but the question that I posed in that conversation was, where does it hurt? And people are hurting.
It was like, I couldn't believe you asked that question. It was like, oh my God, is he reading my soul, or what's going on here?
Yeah.
So Eric, I remember in one of my preps that we were going to do this, you gave your sermon in Nashville. And I was deeply moved by something you said. The true way to honor my father's memory is not to enshrine it in a myth that reveals more about me than about him. It is to live my life and inform my child's life with the useful and helpful parts of my father's ethical DNA. His determination, yes, but maybe not the denialism that left our family unprepared when he passed. His courage, yes, but maybe not his prideful secrecy. Whoa.
Yeah. I mean, that's like what we were just talking about, like the ability to, in a single complex person, whether my dad, your dad, FDR, Donald Trump for that matter. Let us practice this to kind of be able to discern the parts that you would want to shed and the parts that you would want to sustain and emulate. I think that is, but when it comes to our fathers, of course, and you as a father too, and me as a father, that's, at the end of the day, that's literally, we're just here to figure out what to pass on, and how to kind of pass that baton on in some meaningful way.
Beautifully put. How does Olivia see all that you do?
So she's 20, and I think she has been formed by it without wanting necessarily to follow it. She's an English major. She's a good citizen in everyday life, but she doesn't have a passion for democracy, politics, citizenship, or anything like that. But I think, we've always had the kind of relationship where she can keep me from taking myself too seriously. So she's always, from the time she was little, good at making fun of me if I started getting too on my high horse, or and so she's been part of shaping my own voice in this work.
Oh, that's so beautifully put. And then your mother, I remember reading, oh my God, so long ago, I think it was A Chinaman's Chance, and you talked about how y'all would read Confucius together. Do y'all still do that?
We haven't done that in a while now, but we did it for a long stretch where this is when she was living in DC and I was in Seattle. And we decided, instead of just our, weekly phone chats about friends and the news or whatever, we would actually make a little ritual. And I'd read the Analects by Confucius in English translation, but she was like, oh no, that doesn't capture it at all. And so we would just kind of chunk by chunk, read that work, and it's written in this kind of archaic literary form of Chinese. It's not just like translation, it's translation and then translation of the translation, which was, as I wrote in that book of mine, A Chinaman's Chance, it was just it was a gift to be able to have that text as a way to telescope the generations and the cultures and so forth.
But the beautiful thing about beginner's mind, what should I do? What do I do?
Yeah.
That's like,
Chris, you are such a thoughtful questioner and conversationalist, and I keep on turning it back to you because I want people who are watching you to appreciate the tenor and the nature of the questions you ask and the way that you approach the world, and which is partly beginner's mind, partly a child at play, partly a deep philosopher, and partly, as you say, your father's son. And and I think that there's a symphony to your own work, and the to me the model of what it means to live like a citizen is to be able to bring to bear these different strands of yourself in some way that you can share them with others in a, perhaps in a public way, that can inspire others to animate the strands of their own lives, right? People watching us right now, there probably aren't a ton of people who are either the child of Greek immigrants or the child of Chinese immigrants. They are probably the minority of your audience, but everyone's going to be able to find some way into you and hopefully me because of the way you are. And I just appreciate that.
And for me, it's all about my wife, who was a teacher in an indigenous community. She's Mexican. And right now, when I ask what should I do, my focus is on the world's dislocated. I mean, before I was closed up in my house, I met so many who don't have that privilege. They've been dislocated by policy, including US policy, where their lives have been shattered. Many of them don't even, coronavirus is not even on their radar. They're worried about their next meal. They don't even have a place to wash their hands. And so my thought is, well, what do I do right now to make sure that they're not forgotten in an age of intentional xenophobia? Close the doors. It gets my Greek blood boiling.
Yeah, no, and to me, what is most disturbing about the last couple of days is not that Donald Trump has issued an order or stated an intention to issue an order to stop immigration temporarily, but actually what's been most disturbing is how that evinces barely a ripple of reaction, that the public, so beaten down by this crisis, so tired and distracted, probably in some ways so primed for a little bit of xenophobia of their own, just kind of shrugged. And that is the real warning sign, that when you start shrugging about things that are going to the core of the kind of operating system of the United States, getting tossed by the wayside, even if you call it temporary, but temporary means permanently renewable, is a dangerous thing.
It is. Eric, lastly, what you do, and I appreciate it so much, requires such intensity. What do you do to, especially now where we're basically shut off from in many ways? What do you do to just blow off steam and to put things centered? If that's, for lack of a better way of putting it.
My wife Janae, who you know, and who is the co-founder of Citizen University, she is a source of beauty and perspective and balance.
She's amazing.
All the time. And I would say that, my mom, now we moved my mom out to Seattle. She lives just a few minutes away from us. And because she is in frail health now, Janae and I are the only ones who ever see her, so that we limit infection vectors. But that does mean that in this time of coronavirus, pretty much every day, I'm going over to my mom's to visit with her, bring her some food, and time stops. It can be for an hour, it can be for 3 or 4 hours, but time sort of stops, which is really important during this kind of pandemic, because during a pandemic, when you are forced to be at home and your kind of rituals of work and even commute are gone, it can just seem like one interminable day, flowing into one interminable day.
It does.
So having something like that time to go visit breaks the flow of a day, but it also stops time. Last of all, I watch I watch any baseball that I can.
I thought you might say that.
Sports networks are showing classic games and
Yes.
all-time games, and I'm a baseball fanatic, and so that's always a good way to break the flow too.
Absolutely. Well, Eric, thanks so much for the gift of your time. Eric Liu, co-founder of Citizen University and CEO of Citizen University. I look forward to upcoming civic sermons that are going to be presented by some others as well. Thank you so much for your time and your heart and your generosity.
Well, I thank you in exactly the same ways, Chris, for your time, your heart, your generosity, and the example that you keep on setting by doing this work, even when it's for you getting very scary to figure out how to sustain a living from this work. And we will pull together, and I hope you will keep on naming that fear, because you're not alone in it.
Thanks, Eric.
Thanks, Chris.